It was a sweltering day in the heart of Miami when I first caught wind of the case that would soon consume my every waking moment. A gym rat turned celebrity bodybuilder, Jackson, the Beast, Rains, was making headlines, not for his muscles or his endorsements, but for a scandal so twisted, it was hard to tell where the deception ended and the truth began. Jackson was 38, a towering 6'3" powerhouse of a man who had made a name for himself through a mix of strength, charisma, and sheer determination. Born in Chicago in 1986, he'd spent most of his life sculpting his body into a work of art, earning titles and medals that brought him fame in the fitness world. But underneath that chiseled exterior was a man who had a taste for secrets that would eventually lead him into a web of betrayal and murder. It all started innocently enough. Jackson had been a regular face in the Miami fitness scene for years, a fixture in competitions and bodybuilding expos. His wife, Marissa, a petite brunette with sharp green eyes, had been his #1 supporter, standing by his side through the highs and lows of his career. The media painted them as the perfect power couple, Beauty and the Beast, they called them. But as with most things that glitter, beneath the surface was a much darker reality. They had met in the mid-2000s, back when Jackson was still clawing his way to the top. Marissa was a former beauty queen who had pivoted to fitness coaching. Their relationship had been fast, passionate, and, for a while, perfect. But as Jackson's fame grew, so did the distance between them. Marissa would spend nights alone, waiting for Jackson to come home after late gym sessions or sponsor meetings that seemed to stretch into the early morning hours. Jackson's career skyrocketed in 2018 when he won the Mr. Olympia title, a victory that cemented him as one of the best bodybuilders in the world. But while the cameras loved him and the crowds roared his name, there was trouble brewing at home. Marissa grew restless, feeling overshadowed by her husband's success. She had her own ambitions, ones that had been overshadowed by Jackson's spotlight. It wasn't long before rumors of infidelity began circulating. At first, it was whispers, gossip from those who frequented the same circles. Then, one name kept popping up: Angela Grant. Angela wasn't just anyone. She was a juror in a high-profile competition Jackson had participated in a few years back. It wasn't uncommon for athletes to schmooze with the people judging them, but this was different. Angela was 10 years younger than Jackson and known for her fiery personality and love for living on the edge. She wasn't just a fitness judge. She was a wild card, the type who thrived on pushing boundaries. The connection between her and Jackson, though seemingly professional at first, soon became something far more dangerous. The affair was supposed to be a secret, but secrets have a funny way of surfacing, especially when emotions are involved. Jackson and Angela had been meeting for months, sneaking around Miami's luxury hotels, thinking they were invisible. But someone was always watching. And in this case, it was Marissa. Now, I'm no stranger to infidelity cases. In my line of work, you get used to seeing people at their worst. But this one had an extra layer of complexity that no one could have predicted. You see, it wasn't just about two people cheating. It was about power, control, and, ultimately, a deadly obsession. I got involved when Marissa came to me with the news that Jackson had been missing for 2 days. At first, I thought it was just another case of a bodybuilder going on a bender, too deep in his own fame to realize the consequences. But the moment I saw Marissa's face, pale and drawn, I knew something was wrong. She wasn't the desperate wife begging for help. She was terrified. Jackson's not the kind of man to just disappear, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something's happened to him. At that point, the police hadn't officially called it a missing person case. Miami wasn't exactly known for being a city where people stayed within the lines. It was a place where shadows ruled, and people often vanished, only to resurface days later with a half-baked excuse and no memory of the last 72 hours. But Jackson was different. He wasn't just some guy off the street. He was the Beast, and no one had seen or heard from him in days. That's when I started digging. The first place I checked was the gym where Jackson trained, a high-end facility frequented by Miami's elite. His personal trainer, Tony, hadn't seen him in over a week. He's been off, Tony told me, wiping sweat from his forehead. Last time I saw him, he was distracted, kept checking his phone, stepping out during sets. It wasn't like him. The more people I talked to, the clearer the picture became. Jackson had been pulling away from his usual routines, making excuses to avoid people he used to spend every waking moment with. But the real lead came when I found out about Angela. Rumor had it that things between Jackson and Angela had gotten messy, dangerously messy. And when I tracked Angela down, she wasn't exactly forthcoming. She was all charm and smiles when I introduced myself, but there was something behind her eyes, a shadow that told me she knew more than she was letting on. "I haven't seen Jackson in weeks," she said, crossing her legs as she leaned back in her plush office chair. "We don't really talk much outside of competitions." I didn't believe her for a second. The deeper I dug, the more tangled the web became. Angela wasn't just a fling. She had been pushing Jackson to leave Marissa, to start a new life with her. But Jackson, for all his bravado, was a man of habit. He wasn't ready to give up his life, his fame, or his wife. But what Angela wanted, Angela usually got. By the time I reached the third day of Jackson's disappearance, the tension in the air was palpable. Everyone was talking, speculating about what had happened to the bodybuilding star. But no one had answers. Until they found his body. Jackson's body was found in the early hours of the morning, washed up on a secluded stretch of beach just outside of Miami. The discovery hit the news like a freight train, shocking the entire fitness community. This wasn't just a case of a missing celebrity. This was something far darker. I got the call from Marissa before dawn. Her voice was hollow, the kind of tone that tells you someone's world has just crumbled to dust. "They found him," she whispered. "He's dead." There was a moment of silence between us, the weight of those words settling in. My mind raced. I had been working cases for years, but something about this felt different. This wasn't just another celebrity scandal or a lover's quarrel gone wrong. There was something more. Something that reeked of control, of power, and of manipulation. The kind of thing that comes from a place of obsession, not just passion. By the time I arrived at the scene, the police had already cordoned off the area. The beach was deserted, save for a few officers milling around, their faces grim. The body had been covered by a tarp, but I could see the outline of Jackson's massive frame beneath it. Even in death, he looked larger than life, a hulking figure whose strength had finally met its end. Detective Alvarez, a grizzled veteran of the Miami PD, met me just beyond the tape. He was a no-nonsense type, with tired eyes and a demeanor that suggested he had seen one too many bodies washed up on this beach. "You're late to the party," he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "But then again, you always show up when things get complicated." I gave him a nod, glancing over at the scene. "What do we know?" Alvarez rubbed the back of his neck, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Not much yet. His body was found by a jogger around 5:30 this morning. No obvious signs of a struggle, but we won't know for sure until we get the autopsy. For now, all we've got is a dead body and a lot of questions." Questions, indeed. The beach was quiet, the soft lapping of waves the only sound, but the atmosphere was anything but calm. The media had already caught wind of the story, and it wouldn't be long before the vultures descended. But for now, it was just the police, the ocean, and a dead man who had once been larger than life. I stood there for a while, watching as the forensics team worked around Jackson's body. His death had left a void, not just in the fitness world but in the lives of everyone who had known him. And I couldn't help but wonder, who would want him dead, and why? I went back to see Marissa that afternoon, finding her in the sprawling mansion they had called home for the last 5 years. The house felt empty, the kind of silence that clings to everything after tragedy strikes. Marissa was in the kitchen, staring blankly at a cup of coffee she hadn't touched. "He's gone," she said as I walked in, her voice trembling. "How did this happen? Who could have done this to him?" I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. Jackson's death wasn't a random accident. The man was too strong, too careful, to just end up dead on a beach without something, or someone, forcing him there. "I don't know yet," I said, pulling up a chair beside her. "But I'm going to find out." Marissa looked up at me, her eyes bloodshot from crying. "Do you think it was her?" she whispered. "Angela?" It was a question I had been asking myself ever since I heard about the affair. Angela was ambitious, manipulative, and from what I could gather, she had a fierce temper. But would she go as far as to kill him? That was the real question. I don't know, I admitted. But she's definitely someone we need to look into. Marissa shook her head, her hands trembling as she clutched the cup. She hated me, you know. Every time I saw her with Jackson, there was this look in her eyes, like she wanted to take him away from me. I knew about the affair. I didn't say anything because I thought it was just a fling, something that would pass. But now, Jackson was dead, and Angela was the one who had been closest to him in those final months. If anyone had a motive, it was her. I left Marissa's house with more questions than answers. My gut told me that Angela knew something, and I needed to find out what that was. Angela Grant was not an easy woman to track down. After the news of Jackson's death broke, she had gone underground, avoiding the media frenzy that was swirling around her. But I had a few connections in Miami, and it didn't take long to find out where she was hiding. She was holed up in a penthouse apartment on the other side of the city, a sleek, modern building that screamed money and power. When I knocked on the door, it was a while before she answered. Angela looked different from the confident woman I had met days earlier. Her eyes were puffy from crying, and her usually immaculate hair was disheveled. She let me in without a word, leading me to the living room where she collapsed onto the couch. "I didn't do it," she said before I even had the chance to ask. "I never said you did," I replied, sitting across from her. "But you were close to him. You knew him better than most people, especially in the last few months." She ran a hand through her hair, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "I loved him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know people won't believe that, but I did. Jackson and I, we had something special." I raised an eyebrow. "Special?" "From what I heard, you were pushing him to leave Marissa. Doesn't sound all that special to me." Angela's eyes flashed with anger. "He told me he was going to leave her," she snapped. "He said he was done with the marriage. That's why we were together." "But he didn't leave her, did he?" I pressed. "He stayed. And now he's dead." She looked away, tears welling up in her eyes. "I don't know what happened to him. I swear, I don't. The last time I saw him, he was talking about ending things with me. Said it was getting too complicated." "Too complicated for who?" I asked. "You? Or him?" Angela didn't answer right away. She just sat there, staring at the floor, her chest rising and falling with each ragged breath. Finally, she looked up at me, her voice soft. "I thought he loved me," she whispered. "I thought we had a future together." I stood up, my eyes never leaving hers. "Someone killed him, Angela. Whether it was out of love or anger, I don't know yet. But I'm going to find out." She didn't respond as I left the apartment, closing the door softly behind me. Angela might have been in love with Jackson, but love has a way of twisting itself into something far darker when jealousy and betrayal are involved. That evening, I received a call from Detective Alvarez. The autopsy results had come in. "Jackson didn't drown," Alvarez said, his voice steady. "He was drugged. High doses of a sedative in his system. Someone wanted him out of the picture. Permanently." I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the revelation sinking in. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't just a lover's spat gone wrong. This was cold-blooded murder. Murder. The word rang in my ears long after I hung up with Detective Alvarez. It wasn't a shock. I'd suspected as much from the start. But having it confirmed, knowing for certain that someone had intentionally taken Jackson's life, changed everything. The list of suspects was already swirling in my mind, and at the top of that list, Angela Grant. Her confession of love, the desperation in her voice. None of it erased the fact that Jackson had been planning to cut ties with her. That kind of rejection can push people to do dangerous things. But there was someone else I couldn't shake from my thoughts, Marissa. People are quick to assume the other woman is always the guilty party, but what about the wife? The one left behind, humiliated by her husband's affair, living under the same roof with a man who was betraying her? Rage can simmer for years before it boils over. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them sitting in my office. I headed over to Jackson and Marissa's house, the mansion that had been their home for years, now dark and foreboding. Marissa answered the door looking like she hadn't slept in days. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale against the shadows under her eyes. "I need to ask you some more questions," I said, keeping my tone gentle. She was grieving, but grief had a way of revealing things. Sometimes things people didn't intend to let slip. Marissa nodded silently and stepped aside, letting me into the house. The living room was immaculate, as if frozen in time, still expecting Jackson to walk in at any moment. I sat down on the couch, and she sank into an armchair opposite me, folding her hands in her lap. "You said you knew about the affair," I began, watching her carefully. "How long had it been going on?" She swallowed hard, her fingers twisting around each other. "A few months," she whispered. I found out right before Jackson won Mr. Olympia. I didn't say anything at first because I thought it was just a fling, but then it kept going. I could see it in the way he looked at her, like he was obsessed. "Why didn't you confront him?" Marissa sighed, looking down at her hands. "I was scared. Jackson wasn't. He wasn't easy to talk to when he was angry, and I thought maybe it would end on its own, that he would get bored of her and come back to me. I thought he still loved me, somewhere deep down." I leaned forward, my elbows resting on my knees. "Did you ever talk to Angela? Did you ever tell her to stay away from Jackson?" Her head snapped up, her eyes wide. "No. I didn't want to give her the satisfaction of knowing I was hurt. I wasn't going to let her think she'd won. And yet," I said softly, "you were hurt, and now he's gone." Marissa's face crumpled, tears spilling down her cheeks. She pressed her hands to her mouth, trying to stifle the sobs that racked her body. "I loved him," she choked out. "I loved him so much, and now he's dead, and I don't know what to do." I waited, letting her cry, giving her space to feel the weight of her grief. But there was still something gnawing at the back of my mind, something that didn't quite fit. When she finally calmed down, I asked the question I'd been dreading. "Where were you the night Jackson went missing?" Marissa looked up at me, her expression a mix of shock and hurt. "You don't think I had anything to do with this, do you?" "I'm just covering all the bases," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I need to know where everyone was. It's just part of the job." She sniffed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I was here. I haven't left the house in days, except to identify his body." Her voice cracked on the last word, and she fell silent. It wasn't much of an alibi, but then again, there was no one to dispute it. Still, something about her reaction felt genuine, too raw, too broken to be faked. But I couldn't discount her just yet. As I was getting ready to leave, Marissa stopped me at the door. "There's something I didn't tell you before," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "Right before Jackson disappeared, he got a letter. I don't know who it was from, but I saw it in his gym bag. I think it was from Angela." "What did it say?" "I don't know. He tore it up before I could read it. But whatever was in that letter, it upset him. He wasn't the same after that." I nodded, my mind whirring with possibilities. If Angela had sent Jackson a letter, maybe something threatening, or even an ultimatum, it could be the key to figuring out what really happened. I left Marissa's house with a gut feeling that this was about more than just a lover's quarrel. The pieces weren't quite fitting together yet, but I was getting closer. And the next step was clear. I needed to talk to Angela again. Angela wasn't at her penthouse when I arrived, but I had ways of getting answers. After a few calls to my contacts, I tracked her down to a boutique hotel on the edge of the city, the kind of place where people want to disappear. The front desk clerk wasn't much help, but I knew she was there. It was just a matter of finding her. I didn't have to wait long. About an hour later, Angela walked into the lobby, her face obscured by large sunglasses, her hair tucked under a hat. She looked like someone who had everything to hide, and that only made me more determined to get the truth. I approached her as she fumbled with her room key. She froze when she saw me, her face tightening with fear. "We need to talk," I said, blocking her path to the elevators. "I already told you everything," she hissed, her voice low and frantic. "I don't know who killed Jackson." "Maybe," I said, stepping closer, "but you know more than you're letting on." Angela's eyes darted around the lobby, scanning for anyone who might be listening. "Not here," she whispered. "Let's go upstairs." She led me to her room, a sparse but elegant space with minimal furniture and an air of detachment. The second we were inside, She dropped the tough act and slumped into the nearest chair, her shoulders trembling. I didn't kill him, she said, her voice breaking. I loved him, but I didn't kill him. I crossed my arms, leaning against the wall. Tell me about the letter. Angela's eyes shot up, wide with panic. What letter? The one you sent Jackson before he disappeared, I said, watching her carefully. The one Marissa saw in his gym bag. For a moment, Angela was silent, her mind clearly racing. Then she sighed, defeated. It wasn't a letter. It was a note. I was upset. I told him I couldn't keep doing this, that he needed to choose, me or her. And he didn't choose you, I guessed. Angela shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. He said he was going to leave Marissa, but he didn't. He lied to me. He was never going to leave her. I felt like such an idiot. Her voice cracked, and she covered her face with her hands. But I didn't kill him, she sobbed. I swear, I didn't. I just wanted him to choose me. I believed her. Angela might have been desperate, but desperation doesn't always lead to murder. And something about her tears felt real, unforced. But if she didn't kill Jackson, then who did? There was one last thread to pull. I thanked Angela for her time and left the hotel, my mind churning with new possibilities. There was one person who might have had a bigger motive than either Angela or Marissa. Jackson's career wasn't just about lifting weights and winning titles. It was about money, sponsorships, business deals. There were people who stood to gain, or lose, a lot from his success. And if someone in his inner circle had decided that Jackson was more of a liability than an asset, it was time to pay a visit to Tony, Jackson's personal trainer. Tony didn't look surprised to see me when I showed up at the gym. He was in the middle of a session with a client, but as soon as he caught sight of me standing near the front desk, he waved the guy off and walked over, wiping sweat from his brow with a towel. There was something about his eyes, though, a flicker of recognition, maybe even guilt, that told me he knew this conversation was long overdue. You here to ask about Jackson? He said, leaning against the counter with an air of resignation. You know why I'm here, Tony, I replied, meeting his gaze. It's not every day one of your top clients turns up dead on a beach. I figured you might have some insights. Tony sighed, tossing the towel onto a bench nearby. Look, man, I don't know what you think I had to do with this, but I'm as shocked as anyone. Jackson was a good guy. A pain in the ass sometimes, but a good guy. I trained him for years. I nodded, keeping my tone casual. So you knew him well. You knew about the affair? Tony froze for a split second, just long enough for me to catch it. He recovered quickly, but the damage was done. He had slipped. Yeah, he muttered, crossing his arms defensively. I knew. Everyone in the circle knew. But that wasn't my business. Jackson was his own man. He made his choices. Right? I said, stepping a little closer. His choices. Like keeping things with Angela quiet. Like balancing his marriage with Marissa and his affair with Angela. Tony shifted uncomfortably. What are you getting at? I studied his face for a moment before continuing. The autopsy came back. Jackson was drugged before he died. Someone gave him a sedative, enough to knock him out cold. He was unconscious before he ever hit the water. Tony's expression hardened. What does that have to do with me? I'm trying to figure that out, I said, narrowing my eyes. You trained Jackson almost every day. You were close to him. You knew his routines, his habits, what he ate, drank, everything. If anyone had access to him, it was you. Tony's face reddened, his jaw clenching. I didn't kill Jackson, he growled, his voice low and dangerous. You can throw all the accusations you want, but I had nothing to do with this. I held up my hands in mock surrender. Relax, Tony. I'm just trying to get to the truth. But there's one more thing you need to explain. What's that? He spat. Your financials, I said coolly. See, Jackson wasn't just your client. He was also your business partner. And when he died, his share of your new fitness brand went up in smoke. That doesn't look good for you. Tony's eyes flashed with fury. You've got it all wrong. Jackson and I had a solid deal. We were going to launch a whole line of supplements, merchandise, the works. He wasn't just some client to me. He was my ticket to the big leagues. Right? I said, not buying it. And you would have made a killing if the brand took off. But what if Jackson wasn't as invested as you were? What if he was pulling out of the deal? What if he didn't want to do business with you anymore? Tony's fists clenched at his sides, his face a mask of barely contained rage. For a moment, I thought he was going to swing at me, but instead, he took a step back, his chest heaving. "Get out," he said through gritted teeth. "Get the hell out of here." I didn't need to be told twice. As I walked out of the gym, I couldn't shake the feeling that Tony was hiding something. But whether he was capable of murder, that was still up for debate. He had motive, sure, but there was something about his reaction that felt off, as if he was scared, but not of being caught. More like he was scared of someone else. The pieces were all there, scattered across the board like a broken puzzle. Jackson had been drugged, likely by someone who knew him well enough to slip something into his food or drink. Angela had motive. Tony had motive. Even Marissa had motive. But nothing fit together cleanly. It was like there was still one piece missing, one final clue that would reveal the killer's identity. And then, it hit me. I hadn't looked closely enough at the people in Jackson's inner circle. Sure, Angela had reasons to want Jackson dead. Tony had financial motives. But there was one person who had stayed quiet throughout the entire ordeal, slipping under the radar. Jackson's agent. James Dalton was one of those slick, polished types who always knew how to play the game. He'd been managing Jackson's career for years, securing endorsements, sponsorships, and deals that kept the money flowing in. But he also had a reputation for being ruthless, someone who would do whatever it took to protect his clients' brands, or his own interests. I made a few calls, and sure enough, Jackson's recent contract negotiations had taken a nosedive. Rumor had it, Jackson was considering leaving Dalton for a new agent, someone younger, hungrier, who could take his career in a different direction. That wouldn't have sat well with Dalton. Not at all. I decided it was time to pay Mr. Dalton a visit. Dalton's office was a high-rise, all glass and steel, with a view of the Miami skyline that screamed success. I wasn't exactly in the mood for a friendly chat, so when I walked in, I didn't bother with pleasantries. "You didn't think I'd find out, did you?" I said, leaning against his desk as he looked up at me with mild surprise. "Find out what?" Dalton replied, his tone cool and dismissive. "That Jackson was planning to dump you," I said, watching his face closely. He was looking for a new agent, someone who wasn't as cutthroat. Dalton's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something behind his eyes. Jackson and I had a good relationship. He trusted me to handle his career. Maybe he did, I agreed. But he didn't trust you anymore. He was ready to move on, and that would have cost you a lot of money. You would have lost everything you'd built with him. Dalton leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "You're grasping at straws. I had no reason to kill Jackson. I was making more money with him alive than dead." I smirked. "But if he left you, you'd lose out on future deals. That new supplement line? Gone. Endorsements? Gone. And you knew Jackson was about to leave you. So, you took matters into your own hands." Dalton's face remained impassive, but I could see the tension in his jaw. "You have no proof," he said quietly. "Maybe not," I said, pushing off his desk, "but I'm willing to bet the police will find something. And when they do, your little empire will come crashing down." Dalton didn't respond as I walked out of his office, but I knew I'd struck a nerve. I didn't have the smoking gun yet, but I was close. All it would take was one mistake, one slip-up, and Dalton would be finished. It wasn't long before Dalton's world came crashing down. A week later, Detective Alvarez called me with the news. Dalton had been arrested after a search of his office turned up a vial of sedatives, enough to knock out a man of Jackson's size. It was the final piece of the puzzle. Dalton had poisoned Jackson, likely slipping the drugs into his drink after a meeting. He'd wanted Jackson out of the picture, permanently, before the bodybuilder could leave him and take his career elsewhere. It was a classic case of greed and betrayal, the kind that happens when people value money and power over human lives. When I visited Marissa after the arrest, she looked like a woman finally freed from a nightmare. Her eyes were still red, her face still pale, but there was a glimmer of peace in her expression. "Thank you," she whispered as I stood at the door, "for finding out the truth." I nodded, offering her a small smile. Take care of yourself, Marissa. Jackson, he wasn't perfect, but he didn't deserve what happened to him. No, she agreed, her voice soft, but I'm glad it's over. As I walked away from the house, I couldn't help but think about the mess Jackson had left behind. A life built on strength and success, destroyed by secrets, lies, and the people he trusted most. Sometimes, the dead don't just leave behind bodies. They leave behind stories. Stories filled with the kind of darkness most people would rather not see. But in my line of work, I've learned one thing. No secret stays buried forever.